Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to begin first in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Thank you again for joining us. This is, if you've come to the right room, the right virtual room, this is Can I Get a Witness Part 2, hosted by IMAN and MuslimARC. In addition to starting with the name of the Most High, I also just want to start with a land acknowledgement. So just acknowledging that we are on the land of indigenous Anishinaabe, Niswi Meshikadowa, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi people, along with dozens of tribes who are the original stewards of this land. And I want to start off with both of those, just as one, again, acknowledgement to the Most High and acknowledgement to the original stewards of this land because of our topic today and just the moment that we're in today, and how much of the justice and the healing that we want to see in this world is tied to our relationship with the Most High, for those who are spiritual, as well as our relationship to the land and to each other. So by way of introduction, my name is Ahmed Jatan. I'm a community organizer here with IMAN. And today you'll be hearing from many voices. I'm just facilitating here today. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm just here representing IMAN's Corner Store campaign, which involves the work of many, many leaders and partners, some of whom you'll hear from today. It's just a little bit of housekeeping. As you're coming in, please do keep yourself muted. This will allow for some interaction in addition to hearing from the voices that you'll see here. So do please use the chat function. So please in the chat, if you'd like to welcome yourself, where you're from, and if you know the indigenous people of the land that you are, wherever you are in the world, also to acknowledge them in the chat as well. So you can go ahead and use that chat function, and just so that everybody knows that this is a space where you're all welcome to use that chat, to talk to each other, and also interact with us if you have any questions, concerns that you'd like to bring up. And the chat function on the Zoom is right there for you. Moving right along, to speak first, just to show, acknowledging again that we're meeting in virtual space. So as we opened up, I'm also remembering spaces where we opened up, for instance, in our kitchen back at IMAN on 63rd in California, and hoping again of recognizing the limits of what this virtual space does, but also the hidden blessings in it, that we are connecting with people all around the country who are willing to learn about this work. We are based here in Chicago and been working here, and are grateful for the opportunity to be able to share insights with each other all around. And also to acknowledge what brought us here today. So this is part 2 of a conversation that many of you may have attended last month. This is work that IMAN has been doing around corner stores, but it came to the limelight recently because of the murder of George Floyd, which happened in front of a corner store from a call that originated to the police that originated from a Palestinian Muslim-owned business in Minneapolis. So in light of that conversation, in light of the work that we've been doing the past 2 decades, there was a need to be able to have that conversation. So last month we heard from leaders in our campaign, leaders from our organization, as well as leaders from partner organizations, and heard on the ground in Minneapolis from Imam Makram, and hearing from the community there as well. So today, we wanted to continue that conversation, recognizing that just even if media cycles are making their runs, this is still an issue that we are dealing with and have been dealing with, and wanted to share a bit more of the on-the-ground perspective of our work, what our model has looked like, as well as continuing this very important conversation. So what we'll be discussing today, one, again, providing context for Imam's Corner Store model. We'll be outlining the Corner Store curriculum that we've been working with MuslimARC, as well as engaging with you and other stakeholders on next steps, as well as sharing calls to action. And you see some of the themes that we're bringing up today around food sovereignty, racial justice, as well as public safety. And we'll talk about how all of those major themes we are hoping to address in our campaign. And shout out to Amir, who's in this photo, one of our community organizers building in front of one of our corner stores with a community member. So I've already tired of myself talking, and part of what makes this a community organization is the leadership that we have from community members. Again, I'm not an expert here, but what we hope to do is create a space, facilitate a space where people are able to recognize their own power and share their own testimonies. So I'll have with me today Patrice Butler, who is a resident of Chicago Lawn and one of She and her mother are some of the pillars of the Iman community. Whether it is, as you can see, helping with our food distribution mutual aid work, or showing up to organizing meetings around a corner store campaign, or around police accountability, Patrice is there. So without further ado, Patrice, could you introduce yourself a little bit, how you got involved in IMAN, and what makes you motivated in this campaign, what this campaign means to you?
Yeah, so hi, as before mentioned, I'm Patrice Butler, and I've been a leader with the Iman for maybe a year and a half, I would like to say, maybe a little bit longer. The time has definitely flown by. But the corner store campaign is definitely something I've always been interested in, as the corner store is like a big chunk of the area which I live in, which is the Chicago line area. And George Floyd really could have been anyone who lived in my community. His story is just one of many that was brought to the news and broadcasted to the world, but he could have been any regular abiding citizen, and this could have happened to anyone. Not every story gets to be shared, and I'm glad that his story was more of a example to people to shed light of what really goes on in different communities. I would also like to say that discrimination against Black people is not something new in corner stores. It could be due to miscommunication, but this mostly an everyday occurrence for some people. And I believe that a big part of this like discrimination of people is not solely based upon race, but it also has to do with a little bit of ageism. So for the people who aren't familiar with that, it's like discrimination or prejudice against someone who's younger. So for example, a young African American teenager or a young African American woman might be more likely to be followed or tracked in like a corner store or any store for that matter, rather than an older person from the African American community, because it's perceived that that person might be up to no good or stealing or such. So I believe race and ageism play a huge role on how things interact in corner stores. In addition to this, I feel like women feel tend to feel a little bit more unsafe in these corner stores due to the large chunk of loitering that goes on from people. Most corner stores can be like categorized, or they have like a duality of also being a liquor store. Now I know that there's no clear distinction from what a corner store and a liquor store is, since I believe most corner stores do sell liquor, but it can create an unsafe environment for many people who are shopping, because corner stores tend to be like an everyday stop for people picking up the ins and outs, and with a lot of loitering and just violence going on, it can make it a very unsafe place to be. So that's why I believe this corner store campaign and initiative is going to really bring some change upon what's going on. And I'm not just saying this because I work with this campaign, but I do go to corner stores and sometimes I do feel unsafe there. And I feel like Iman is doing something very beautiful here, because this is not a topic that many people are concerned about, or they just think of it as an everyday occurrence. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice, for sharing that. And thank you for all the work that you do in making sure that our corner stores, we are able to envision the world that we want, and for sharing your perspective. And if you don't mind, as I'm sharing about the corner store campaign a little bit more, Patrice, please feel free to chime in based off of your own experiences that you've had. And so, just to give a quick introduction about IMAN and some of the ways that we serve the community. So we're a community organization that fosters health, wellness, and healing in the inner city by organizing for social change, cultivating the arts, and operating a holistic health center. So to put that in layman terms, basically just that, one, our main direct service that we provide the community is a federally qualified health clinic. Also, from the very beginnings of IMAN, about 20 years ago, also had a community organizing ethos, recognizing it wasn't enough just to provide this direct service without also addressing some of the more fundamental causes of the inequalities and some of the health issues that people were facing. And we're talking about health, their physical health, their social health, their spiritual health. And that's what led us, from the inception of IMAN, to working with corner stores, specifically in the neighborhood that we're in, and addressing health the way that corner stores are one of the determinants of where people get their food, where they may have certain social interactions, and a place where there's potential healing and transformation able to happen. Our approach is one that is that we organize holistically to sustainably address needs, and we're led by residents who are directly affected. So for instance, Patrice, who you just heard from, and her mother, Patricia, as I mentioned before, that are pillars of this community, are who are leading the work. It's not about me as an organizer coming in and figuring out how we're going to solve this corner store issue. It's about listening to the people who are directly affected. And those who are directly affected are those who are living in the neighborhoods, who have to shop at these stores every day, as well as those who are running the stores, who are invested in this work. And at the same time, we don't cut off power. So although we are led by those who are most directly affected by this issue, those who are living in these neighborhoods and shopping at the stores, if there are other people who are connected to the work, whether their family owns a store or they're invested in racial justice or health, whether they are living in the surrounding area, or for instance, partners that we have at the university, we're not going to cut ourselves off from that power to be able to build together for this world, all the while still being led by those who are directly affected. And that informs some of our approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into our curriculum and what we're developing to share our work. Oftentimes when we talk about our campaign, we share these maps, and this or a version of these maps are maybe familiar to you. And when I share these maps, I also often recognize
Ahmed, you're on mute.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. So part of the way that these, to address these maps, when I present these maps, as I said, are usually beneficial to people who aren't living in the community. If you're living in the community, you know your reality. You don't need the maps to tell you what your reality is. At the same time, it's still a good tool to be able to show the structural, the structural nature of this issue. So over here, we have a map of Lakeview. And Lakeview is a neighborhood on the north side of Chicago, for those who aren't familiar. And you can see, okay, there's one vacant lot. We've got 6 major food retail establishments, some chains like Jewel Osco, as well as some mom and pop kind of grocery stores, and 2 corner stores, convenience stores. Then you zoom to a neighborhood right adjacent to IMAN, where we do a lot of our work, which is West Inglewood. And you see what the difference is. This is a neighborhood on the south side, predominantly Black residents, upwards of 90%. And you can see the difference here. 111 abandoned buildings, which are in the dark orange, 240 vacant lots in the yellow, and 7 corner stores and 1 major food establishment. And the major food establishment is also just a Walgreens. And it's considered one just because it has some produce and multiple checkout lines, but as we know, not an actual food retail store. So when people see these maps, often the word that comes to mind that people think of is food desert. That's how people describe these neighborhoods. Another word that I actually prefer to use rather than food desert is food apartheid, for multiple reasons. One is that a desert is a naturally occurring ecosystem that happens at a certain latitude. What we see here isn't naturally occurring, it's artificial. It was made by active disinvestment from these communities. And the reason I call it apartheid is, as you can see, the divisions in the same city, north to south, largely determined by race. And you see what this difference is in terms of access to food. And another thing that this map illustrates is the larger issue that happens in these neighborhoods. Again, these empty lots can often become hotspots of violence in the community. And it's also just an illustration of the larger economy that these stores are in. Which brings me to the next point of, in the work that we're doing, as we're addressing how we are having conversations in the community and with corner store owners, recognizing as we talk about how this is relational work, that there's a structural issue here, that the stores themselves are operating in a certain economy, and how do we work together to start making a shift in this larger issue, and its connection to issues as we have already talked about safety and public safety around corner stores. So the ways that, how do we start addressing these empty lots in different ways that IMAN has done that? So a summary of what is the problem here. So to summarize, 1, limited access to nutritious food options, 2, public safety, and 3, the racial tensions that we've mentioned. Some of the ways that we address that, again, is through a systems approach. So when we talk about the corner store, we're also talking about the whole food ecosystem, from the garden all the way until it gets to your shelf. And this is something that we pull from as I said at the beginning, in terms of our relationship to the land. So acknowledging another reason why I don't like the word food deserts, there's many efforts in Inglewood, across the South Side, all across Chicago, to actually grow food and that are happening. For instance, an organic farm in the heart of Inglewood in Growing Home. So part of what we're addressing the what is on the corner stores before we even get to the corner store is, where is our food coming from? What are ways, if we're thinking about justice, we're not just talking about food access, but food sovereignty. So what is our connection to the land? And what does the connection to the land, having sovereignty and stewardship over the land, to your businesses, to your neighborhoods, to your community institutions, what does that mean for our liberation? And part of the ways that we do that, one is we have an educational garden or connections to local farms, as I mentioned, like Growing Home. We have a farmers market where community members are able to build relationships with local farmers. We also sometimes will take field trips, for instance, to Pembroke, Illinois, where there is a collective of Black farmers that have been working that land for generations, owning and working that land for generations, and building that relationship up. From there, doing community building among our base, whether they come through our health center or are in part of our Green Reentry program, and others that come through IMAN, inspired by our vision for social justice, or looking for a place to build community. And in that, well, part of it is also looking at the corner store as a site in our community for possible healing and possible building up of healthy communities and safer communities altogether. And the way that we do that, one, developing alternative business models for corner stores on the Chicago South Side, which we'll talk about, an actual, not just developing the model, but developing an actual brick and mortar corner store and what that model can look like. We can talk about that later. 2 is using public policy to promote lasting change toward food justice, looking at food policies that we can organize around and advocate. The next is re-engaging community members around healthier lifestyles rooted in their own food cultures. So in some ways, you could say it's just education around nutrition, but part of what we're doing is re-engaging people already in the food cultures that they have towards healthier living. How did your grandmother cook? How did your great-grandmother cook? How can we share how our grandmothers cooked and learn from each other what a healthy lifestyle means? It's not enough just to advocate for this if we're not also ourselves living this out. And I can share a quick story on that. When we used to have our organizing meetings, oftentimes we'd order pizza, which is often in lots of organizing meetings, until we thought, what are we doing here? We're talking about food justice. We're talking about food access. But we are talking about food, but are we actually doing anything about it? We have a kitchen right here. Let's come in a little bit early and cook together, talk about the food, build over the food, and then when we sit down, we can talk about how we're going to plot to be able to make a more just world. And that's, again, engaging in ways that are familiar to us of how we're building towards a most just world. There's nothing more ancient, nothing more unifying than building over food, whether it's a difficult conversation or one where you're just building relationships, which gets to also healing racial tensions between Muslim and or Arab store owners and Black neighborhood residents, which is, when we think about it and all that we're doing, the conversation of race is present, because this is America, and that's the story of America. If you're talking about any kind of social injustice in America and you're not thinking about race, you're looking at it completely wrong. So in anything that we're doing, if we're talking about food access and not talking about race, we're missing a big part of the picture. Just to share a little bit more background, this is just to illustrate some of the corner stores that we've engaged in Chicago. As you can see, many of them are on the south side, although we do also work a little bit on the west side as well. And you can see the neighborhoods that we're focused in, Chicago Lawn and West Inglewood. Our approach is, being able to, we would like to make as big a change as we want, at the same time recognizing the most effective change you're going to make is if you are focused hyper locally. So talking to others who are in the chat, if you're in California, there's not much I can do that IMAN can do for you from California. We can have a conversation but really it's the set of relationships that you have that create the power that you want. And that's the last thing that I want to say before we start digging into the curriculum, is the model of building relational power. There's been a lot of conversations around solidarity. I'm speaking for myself as a Palestinian, a lot of ways that we've thought about Black Palestinian solidarity. And one way that I think about how to build solidarity in general is that it starts with relationships. That's it's not enough just to make the intellectual connection about how struggles are connected. When, if we think about in Chicago, probably the most common relationship, if we're talking about Black and Palestinian relations, the most common relationship is probably a transactional one that's happening at a corner store. It's a guess, but I don't think I would be way off to say that. And that is to say that there's tremendous potential there. If you're thinking about how do we actually build solidarity, is to start with the relationships that are already in place and how do we transform those relationships. In addition, part of the way that this campaign is run is, again, building genuine ties of community of how we're going to protect each other. So if we think about what's really at stake here in terms of safety of residents at corner stores, for instance, that's not going to happen, especially for those who are interested in a world that relies less on police or not on police at all. That's not going to happen if you don't have actual relationships of trust where we feel like that we can actually protect each other. So that's some ways that we're talking about how we're building relational power. And we've done that through different activities, engagements, including the curriculum that we're rolling out and developing now. Before I move to the curriculum, Patrice, was there anything that I missed or anything that you want to highlight about your experience with the campaign?
Sure. I'd just like to add that since you mentioned it, about the whole food desert situation, you don't really like to call it that. I've grown up in the Chicago-Lawn community my whole life. And one of our only main sources of getting groceries was Aldi, or just picking up a few odds and ends from the corner store. Because when they did add a Whole Foods in this area, it's much too expensive for most of the residents in this community. So Whole Foods is there, but it's more there in like terms of gentrification. Like my mother and I, we don't really shop there because the items are very expensive. We do more shopping at Aldi's, or as you mentioned in one of the slides before, Fair Play, which is not too far from our community, but we still have to travel out of our communities to get more access to the goods that we need. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I had to contribute.
Thank you, Patrice. And I'm sure there's much more that you can contribute, but I do want to make sure that we're able to get a full conversation going here, and we will have a Q&A. So again, if there are any questions that are arising, please do put them in the chat, and whether we're addressing them now or addressing them later, please feel free to put those in the chat. And Patrice, again, thank you again for the ways that you've been involved in the campaign. All the things that I mentioned, I can recall you being there in front of our corner stores, canvassing people, or at our farmers market, or spreading the good word in the neighborhood. So thank you again. Moving along, I would like to introduce Sister Marguerite Hill. As I said, I'm not an expert in anything, so I'm glad we're finally hearing from an expert. Marguerite is our executive director at MuslimARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative. And we have been working on a curriculum together of how we are hoping to address this issue. So without further ado, I'd like to just kick it to Margaret.
Thank you for having me. And I'm definitely not an expert. I've learned so much whenever I'm in a workshop. I learn just as much from my participants as I'm teaching. I've also been a student of yours, learning so much through this process of building out curriculum, learning about the store owners and the community and the stakeholders. And so, like this has just been like such an enriching process as someone who's directly benefited from the community organizing training from IMAN. So it's a deep honor to be here and to do this work. So as we go to the next slide, as far as the the task that we're working on it. And so we wanted this curriculum, like it's drawing from like values-based. So from these principles, right? So there's 7 principles, and we can go into those during the Q&A. But IMAN had developed these 7 principles, and in our partnership, it's like, how do we think about kind of a liberatory education model to implement principles that are like holistic principles that make stores like a site of connection, of peace building and community, right? And so, you know, we'll go into this in a little bit, but these are really great principles that we're going to be putting into these learning objectives. So just to read out, I'll try not to read out any more slides. I usually hate when instructors, they read out the slides, but I want to really be clear as far as like what we're trying to achieve, because Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, we have a few pedagogical frameworks that we really hold tight to it. And one of those is the backwards design. Like, what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve with participants? So having some clear objectives that are manageable, right? That are feasible, that's key. And so, you know, the three things that we really wanted to highlight is faith, right? And we're talking spirituality. So it doesn't have to be like, not all the participants have to be Muslim, but, you know, whether it's, you know, one's spiritual tradition, Black and brown liberatory frameworks are really tied to spirituality. And so we wanted to highlight faith as an anchoring principle, like as an anchoring objective. And then anti-racism. So we wanted to incorporate an anti-racism frame and really center that in our curriculum and the power building. So just to kind of read out what we're trying to do is like through dialogue and storytelling. So storytelling is like really key in what we do, that we're having the participants flesh out the historical, social, and political systems that shape their lives, that shape this interaction between the corner stores, like in the placemaking, the corner stores in Chicago neighborhoods. So this first pilot is really focusing on Chicago, which I've spent a lot of time in, and I really love Chicago for, you know, the amazing work that y'all do. And I also understand, you know, even like what the issues of like why the neighborhoods are segregated, right? And the racial justice issues and the work that IMAN is doing. And we also have a number of other partners doing that. So kind of diving right back into the objectives. Our goal was to root this initiative in faith-based Black and brown liberatory framework that highlight those 7 principles, right? That we can flesh those out through that process. The anti-racism, we want to provide culturally relevant racial justice education to corner store owners and stakeholders, where the participants explore their racial socialization. So, you know, we're talking about people of color, right? And we're talking about horizontal oppression. And so those are things that for us to build solidarity, we have to unpack how we're racialized and in the systems of oppression that we may be complicit in. And in this specific case of like the food deserts, of the lack of access, right? And even the sites of interpersonal discrimination that residents are experiencing. But we believe in that the store owners, when they explore their own social identity and are and have the other storytelling, the storytelling from other participants and understanding displacement, and the economic conditions, like what are the social conditions that led us here today? So that's the anti-racism framework. And then finally of store owners and stakeholders, building power through authentic relationships. So I'm really excited to bring together, once again, because IMAN has been a really great partner with us in both anti-racism and power building. So yeah, next slide, kind of go into some of the principles that shape what we're doing. We don't believe in doing a kind of top-down training. So yeah, this is one of my favorite experiences. This is the Muslim Power Building Project, and we had IMAN organizers. This is like actually from a partnership between Faith in Action, Empower Change, IMAN, and MuslimARC. And so our pedagogical framework is a popular education model, both from South America, so the Paulo Freire's framework, but also from the Black radical tradition. And so we're doing a lot of like storytelling circles, drawing upon Black and brown liberatory traditions. And Ahmed, we had really great conversations around some of like the like Arab organizers, like in the Arab Spring, and like the terminology. And so there was like, as I was talking about, here's some Islamic terms for justice, and you introduced me to other, other terms. And I was like, this is important for us to talk about these indigenous systems, right, that we have. And we wanted to have a cultural responsive anti-racism. A lot of our anti-racism work is well developed on a Black-white framework. But when we start talking about in a predominantly people of color space and acknowledging the trauma of all of the participants, that's really important. And that through storytelling that we'd have our power building and forming deep connection. So within our framework is like a really deep, we've had deep discussions as far as like, what are the needs of the shop owners? There's been like some really great articles that talked about their challenges with nuisance laws, but also getting their feedback in developing curriculum. So, I mean, Ahmed, you've been, you and Sada have talked with shop owners to get their feedback on those the 7 principles. And that's informed my work. And I hope that, you could kind of elaborate a little bit more because you've been more on the ground. I'm working in Southern California. We have Sahaba Initiative that's definitely interested in this project. So I'm definitely interested in doing more placemaking in San Bernardino County where I'm at. So, as I'm learning from your interactions, right, with the shop owners, with the residents, with the organizers, that's helping me build out a stronger curriculum that centers the most impacted. And that's not us teaching people the principles, but for them to be able to articulate from their own experiences, what does it look like for these principles to play out? So so I think that's like most of it there. Really exciting work. I'm really excited to learn along with people and through our Q&A to really flesh out, our next steps in developing the curriculum before we roll it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marguerite. And it's likewise, the process that we've had together to be able to build this out has been super transformative for me in terms of all that I've been learning from you and just the process of like what happens when we're able to collaborate. So thank you again. And I guess just the highlight of part of what I see here is that this isn't just, I guess to summarize, this isn't just a sensitivity training that we're talking about. We're looking at how do we actually make intentional spaces where we can share stories and build power together and strategize together. So for instance, I mean, the experience that I have walking with Ms. Butler, Patrice's mother, as she tells me her family history in that neighborhood as one of the first Black families to move into Chicago lawn, and the intimidation and violence that was faced by KKK and other white supremacists. Sharing that story, me sharing my own story of my family coming as refugees, and the power that's built as we're doing that, walking to a corner store that she shops at, where she knows the butcher and she knows the owner, where then I'm able to go and speak to the owner in Arabic and reach them in a different kind of way. So how do we then create those intentional spaces so that interaction can be multiplied, in a room together, and also to be able to be relevant, drawing from our own traditions of the way that we do that. So it's been beautiful to do that. Speaking about having interactions with corner store owners, who I wanted to introduce next, to give some insight and maybe even some initial feedback from conversations we've had around the principles, is Muhammad Ramadan, who's been a longtime leader at IMAN. And it's a real pleasure to have him. He's also an attorney here in Chicago. And Muhammad, if you just want to introduce yourself, how you've been involved with IMAN, what has attracted you to IMAN's work in the Corner Store campaign, and also if you'd like to share just some of your own insights about what is the sentiment and the temperament of store owners right now and the interactions you've had. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Salam everyone, my name is Muhammad Ramadan. I am an attorney in Chicago. A lot of my work is representing business owners in Chicago, surrounding areas, but most of my work is in Chicago. So I do deal with City Hall, Aldermans, BACP, and all those regularly. First, to answer your question as far as what attracted me to IMAN, it's very simple. I'm actually a product of IMAN. I grew up on 63rd. I was at the very first taking it to the streets, which I'm proud to say. So I've been around IMAN since I was younger, and I always say I am a product of IMAN. So this is once I got out of law school and kind of got established, kind of just reached back out, and as I like to say, I kind of get in where I fit in, wherever I can kind of help out. I do. So I basically provide support for you and Saad and everyone else that works on this. So I do have an ear to the street, as they say. I do talk to these store owners regularly. I represent a lot of them. I've lost some clients because of this program, because we give them some harsh realities, and a lot are receptive. Sometimes they're not, and I think sometimes when they see another Arab kind of giving them their perspective, they're not always receptive, but I think there's more that are than that aren't. I do want to kind of touch up on a couple things. The one thing I stress to everyone when we discuss this is to focus on nuance. These are not necessarily black and white issues. There's a lot of nuance that goes on, to the corner store, to the community relations, and everything else that, was discussed before this. In order to really kind of get into the nuance, we need to have dialogue. And I think dialogue is the number one thing right now if you really want to progress to the next step and make real substantive change, you kind of have to start there. And I think, and I told Ahmed, I think I told Sada this over the phone. This is the first time that I really felt that the Arab community is really kind of doing an internal assessment, per se, if I can phrase it that way, where there's a lot of discussion going on. What is our role in these communities as business owners? What is our role as Muslims in general? And so on and so forth. So that discussion is being thrown out a lot more than I've seen historically, which I think is definitely a positive. I also feel that it's partially a younger generation thing. It's not completely younger generation, but I feel that the younger generation is really pushing the conversation right now. And I think that's a good start. However, the flip side of it is a lot of the corner store owners right now have a sense of, I don't want to say being attacked, but to them, we're always the bad guys. It's always our fault, no matter what we do. And when we got looted, nobody even bothered to make a statement for us. Nobody even cared to really, extend an olive branch to them. So a lot of the store owners did kind of look at it and, view it as we're always perceived as the bad folks. But when something happens to us, it goes silent. But if something happens at our store, all hell breaks loose. And they feel that there is a double standard when it comes to kind of how they're treated. I don't shy away from this, and I hope I don't offend anyone. Particularly, if a lot of this comes from their aldermans. There is a double standard from the aldermans. They do kind of put this pressure on them, and then when they need the assistance to flesh out these ideas, they're not there for them. They don't get the support. So it is kind of a double standard that a lot of these store owners feel. And the reason I bring that up is the problem that store owners have is they're kind of stuck between the two. And what I mean by that is they're stuck between the city and they're stuck between the community. So I know one thing we discussed was for the store owners not to call the police as much, right? And I know that was one topic that we discussed. And I said, Ahmed, you can't say that. And the reason is we are told the opposite from the city. I've had clients who are in revocation hearings. When I say revocation hearings, it means the city's trying to revoke their license simply for not calling the police enough. They make you have a log. They want you to call the police every single time someone is loitering, someone is doing in front of your store. And if they feel that you are not calling enough, they will literally say your logs are very bare, and that's code for you're not calling police enough, or now we're going to come for your license. You're not doing what we're telling you to do. Then the community, on the other hand, is telling them, hey guys, we don't trust the police. Don't call them as much. Let's figure out other ways. So they get a little bit of confusion there and saying, hold up, the people that are giving me my license are threatening to take it away if I don't call the police and I don't do all these things. But then the community that I'm in is telling me the opposite, that we don't want a strong police presence. So there's a lot of confusion when it comes to that. Second, they don't get much support. And when I say support, most business owners will tell you, we don't like loitering either. It's not safe for our customers. It's not safe for us. And it just leads to other things. But either A, they don't call or say anything out of fear or retribution, or B, they'll call the police will come, the people will go away. As soon as the police leave, they come back. Hence why the police say, when we tell them that, their response is always, well, call us again, keep calling, keep calling, keep calling. So, when we have these meetings, it's not just the alderman, it's the alderman, the police commander, their assistants, city hall. So this entire city basically telling us, well, keep calling, keep calling, keep calling. There's a lot of misinformation out there as well. I've had to correct police in front of other store owners who are non-Arab store owners who are told to basically call the police and report a crime. They portray it as, oh, you will not be on the police report. You will not, the person will not know who reported it, which is false. And when, I corrected them, the people were, rightfully so, they were scared. And they said, no, we won't report it because we're scared of retribution. And that's across the board. That's just not Arab store owners. Now, with all that being said, a lot of what we stress is, what I stress to clients and, when I pitch it to store owners, my philosophy is very simple. Good business is good for business. If you do well for your community, I promise you, you will see it tenfold within your profits. If you just implement certain minor changes, in the long run, it is going to be beneficial for your business. So for me, when I pitch these guys, they're businessmen, you kind of have to pitch it in dollars and cents, even though we'd like to pitch it in a more sociological, more ethical framework. What I found for me that works is showing them that, hey, if you follow some of these steps and some of this advice, that it would eventually lead to better community relations. Better community relations would therefore lead to more revenue. More revenue, of course, leads to more profits. And I found that to be the most beneficial. But I will say that the dialogue needs to happen, and it needs to happen honestly. And I think this is the moment for it to happen. I do think the rioting and looting really kind of brought it to light, and I think people are ready to have that conversation. I know COVID kind of threw everything out, but that's what I would stress is pay attention to nuance. Just when you're talking about store owners, just please always remember that the city's on the other side of us telling them different things. And they're generally going to listen to the people who issue the license or revoke it over people like us. So I think that's something that gets lost in the conversation, is the responsibilities that the store owners face. But with all that said, there is change that needs to be made. And I think we make that clear when we approach these stores, that there are changes that need to be made. But it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think the conversation does need to start now.
Thank you, Mohammed, so much for sharing your insights, sharing your perspective, and some of your knowledge based off of your experience. With that, we've kind of ended the formal part of our program, but what I did want to provide an opportunity for, one is for questions from the audience. And as you're thinking about questions you might have for a particular person that has spoken, or a particular insight you want to share, I want to give an opportunity for those who have spoken if they have questions for each other. So if Patrice, Marguerite, Mohammed, if there's any questions or things that you have for each other as we're all here and have spoken.
Oh, the floor is open to us, or
yes? No, to yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest question that I have is from a practical matter. How do we get people to have these conversations? And I think someone like Patrice's mother, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, who's been around for so long, who's been through so much, how do we get people from both sides to sit down and have an honest conversation, right? Not some tippy toe where, we really need to discuss it. I guess what we're trying to figure out is, how do we practically do it and get people to actually be open, honest, and have this real discussion? I think that's kind of what we've been trying to figure out from our end.
Mm-hmm. one thing I can think of is actually in one of our organizing meetings, Patrice, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we were discussing actually that issue of nuisance abatement laws. So precisely you're talking about, Muhammad, in the ways that the system has it set up. So if these stores in these low-income Black neighborhoods are not effectively acting as another kind of surveillance or arm of the police, their licenses, become at threat. Patrice, you were sharing how you felt like it might be uncomfortable, not your place, to talk to a store owner about how much you should call the police or not. So I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit about those feelings that you had, or the conversation we had around that.
I feel like most of the corner store owners want to keep a good repertoire with us customers, so they don't want to offend them in any way, such as telling them like that they can't lawyer, because they want to keep up like a good repertoire, have a good business to say, this corner store owner is cool, he allows us to do XYZ. So I think it's a fear of like losing reputation, I guess, or even in some cases, in some corner stores, protection. Like some people will say, oh, we'll guarantee you protection if like this person comes in, we'll stop if like something happens. I think it's a little bit of distrust on both parties though. It's like a 50-50 mutual distrust. I feel like it's not all one-sided necessarily.
And do you feel like you have any ideas of how we can start chipping away at that mistrust and start building trust?
I feel like it may start with the model, for example, that you were bringing up, how some people present the model. I definitely don't think I would be the best candidate for that, however, as I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. But somebody else who's more comfortable in that area, who feels more confident in the model and feel like they could break through with the owner, I'm definitely not too comfortable in that position, however, as I mentioned before.
No, and thank you for sharing that. And I think that's exactly in terms of when people are thinking about, okay, how do I get involved, for those who are attendants? As much as we're led by those who are directly affected, it's not always the most comfortable, the most safe to be able to have these hard conversations. Part of the idea with the training is to create a space outside of the site where it's happening, so that we can be able to have these conversations in a real way. That's one thing. And the other, as we're continuing this work, there is a role for other immigrant Arab who might already have a relationship, even if it's twice removed, to the store owner, to start being able to start these conversations. And then to start facilitate larger conversations with the store owners. One thing I could say of different ways that we are doing it at IMAN to start breaking some of that mistrust and start building that is, for instance, ever since the start of the pandemic, we've started food distribution at IMAN. And the pandemic has affected a lot of people's work in many different ways. At the same time, especially in the work that we're doing, still have to think, okay, creatively, how are we, meeting people's immediate needs in this moment, but also continuing to push for the changes that we want to see. And that's something that we were working on since the beginning of the pandemic, and thinking about, okay, if we're distributing food now to meet this immediate need, how do we leverage the relationships we have with corner store owners for corner stores to become a site of mutual aid? And most store owners, if you came to them, when I came to them and offered this to them, were very receptive, even if it was against their immediate business interest to be handing out free food in front of their store when they're selling food inside. They had enough of a relationship, had enough of a sense that people are suffering right now. This is good relief for them. And also, at the end of the day, it's good business, as Muhammad shared. Good business is good for business. It builds trust in the community that, oh, this is a store that will look out for us. So even in that small way that could be seen as just a direct aid, we're there building relationships and engaging people on the same issues that we've been engaging them around the public safety in these stores. And in ways, for instance, when we're handing out fresh produce in front of the stores, it signifies to the owner that there is a demand for these products, so that excuse flies out the window of why we can't have fresh produce. There is a demand.
So I want to speak on that, Ahmed. I'm glad you brought that up. I think one of the biggest issues that I see from the community and the store owners is there's too many misconceptions and false truths out there that people tend to believe, and they kind of latch onto it. For example, I preach to store owners. A lot of them will say what you say. Oh, well, they don't want to eat healthy. I'm like, Habibi, you haven't put a single healthy item in here to sell in 5 years. How do you know they don't want to eat healthy? That's just a misconception from the store owner that they do not want to eat healthy, when in reality, I think everybody in the world would like to eat healthy if they had the options to do so. The flip side, the one thing that I always hear that I find funny is, well, these Arabs come here and they don't pay taxes for 7 years and they get a loan for a business and they open up. Well, that's not really true. And I think those kind of false equivalencies kind of build some of that mistrust, or that, hey, how come they get no taxes and a loan and they're new to this country and our community doesn't? And it kind of builds this kind of tension. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions that simple education can clear up, that can really kind of soften the blow a little bit. But there's a ton of misconceptions on both sides. And I think that really clouds the relationship, in my opinion.
I'm wondering, Marguerite, if there's anything that you wanted to share. And also for those who have questions, please do put them in the chat if you have any questions for anybody who's spoken or perspective you'd like to share.
Yeah, I think what part of, like, in our curriculum, when we thought about like the target audience and whether we're doing affinity groups where like we want to recognize like some conversations where in that affinity group, they need to hash that out in a space where they're kind of safe to explore, and they have someone from their own affinity group to facilitate and to push them, to move beyond that. But then at the same time, like when it comes to doing kind of anti-racism, like coming together as a group and through the storytelling of dismantling those tropes, like those tropes that serve white supremacy and pit the groups against each other. And so dismantling those, and that's part of like what our curriculum intends to do, like, which is like what, like for them to lift up the tropes that justify the current, tense relationships, or the current situation, to unpack those and to think about other ways that we could build solidarity by knowing each other's stories, and then thinking about like imagining new ways of being in community. So I think that's, like what we hope to flesh out. And obviously the buy-in of participants of like, why should people come to be in a space, and especially if they're thinking like, look, I'm gonna get yelled at, or I'm gonna get, all of the tropes, like I'm gonna just get harmed in that space, of really having like a tightly facilitated, experience that will allow us to unpack a lot of that nuance that that Muhammad had mentioned, like, and that's where we have to address the root causes of that distrust, and then think about new ways that we can build trust, and how it benefits everyone if we have a better understanding of each other. So, I'm not saying we have all of the answers, but there's ways, like, tried and tested means of people having meaningful discussion and coming out with a commitment towards each other to improve Chicago neighborhoods. I'm reading there's a few comments and questions here on the side.
Yes, I'm checking them out too. So just to read them out, from Ala, I've really enjoyed this conversation. And from all speakers, I appreciate the moving set of ideas. I want to know, with regards to racialization of geographies being discussed, what is Iman and his partners' outlook on archiving, documentation, and or preservation of these important narratives in doing this work? That's a great question. I will say that we do have partners at UIC. Shout out to Dr. Angela Odoms Young. I think she was in the room. I know Baba Oren is here, who also from UIC, who do this kind of work. And there are oftentimes, as an organizer, that sometimes the what you hear from academia feels like disconnected in an ivory tower, not really relevant to what we're dealing with on the ground. But I think that there are ways that academia we use to, the partnerships in academia use to, one, make that academic experience more rich, and also the resources that are in these institutions, again, not cut us off from that power to be able to do things like preserve these histories and these oral histories. We do not have a project particularly about documenting, preserving kind of the histories, but I think that's a great idea that we can start incorporating of course, with the understanding that we're respecting people's own privacy and narrative, and in a way that people can take ownership of that. I think that's a beautiful idea. Next, we have from Christian. Thank you for this conversation. As someone who does work around Black policy and solidarity, I will note that negative interactions with Arab liquor stores and gas stations came up as a barrier to building solidarity in Detroit, especially because, as Ahmed noted, this is one of the primary interactions between Black and Arab immigrant communities in some of our cities. I know there are quite a few Arab Americans interested in organizing corner stores due to the current protest. Is there written material on this campaign / approach to share? Thank you. So in terms of the written material, we do have written material in terms of like campaign materials, petitions, and other kind of materials that we've used at some of our engagements at corner stores. In light of the current moment, and that's part of what we're working with MuslimARC, is really kind of updating, rehashing, and solidifying that curriculum that could be ready to be shared in other contexts. Because right now our work has been very much hyper-local in Chicago, but recognizing if people can benefit from our model to start developing that toolkit. So Christian or anybody else who's interested, please do be in touch with me, and I can share the resources that what we do have, and also to initiate conversations of how we can spread this work elsewhere. We will have at the end of this webinar share out the full principles with the language we have around them now, to already get some of your feedback from that, and also an opportunity to connect with this work further. Next is, I agree, well, let me see. I agree with the misconception on both sides. This is from Ravneet. Welcome, Ravneet. And having dialogues can be helpful. What challenges we can have, or having to bring them on the table, or having these dialogues, especially from store owners' side?
Could I answer that one, Ahmed?
Let me see if Marguerite or Patrice, was there anything you wanted to add to answer before Muhammad jumps in?
I mean, I know, like from those who have been subjected to discrimination, like in the store, like there's a lot of pain, right? Like there's the trauma, and from the Muslim side, the two kind of intense places of interaction that Black and Arab, it's like it's the mosque or the stores, right? And so, and the mosque is kind of like the bridge building, but then it's like the point of contention are these stores, and so I'm not. Like, I do think that there needs to be that kind of trauma-based healing work that's in group, especially for the Black community to talk about, like to kind of process some of that, because it's hard to have a productive conversation, right? For when you haven't had accountability for, being called certain names and you can recognize them, or experiencing sexual harassment in these stores, and not just from the loiterers, but the shop owners. And, and so there's like, those are things that need to be kind of worked out. But I do think for those who are committed to being at a longer event, not just a 2-hour one-off, but whether it's like a half day or a full day, we can have productive conversations that move the needle forward. We don't want to just, I think the challenge is not just like unearthing trauma, and then you also have fragility, right? And defensiveness. And so we're kind of like trying to balance that kind of like, prejudice reduction and collective action, and doing it all at once, like while trying to build solidarity. And, and there's a lot of hurt. And you also have, like, I've talked with children of store owners whose relatives have been harmed, like they've been shot. Like, how do you talk with people who are literally in fear, right? And so there's a lot of trauma that people have to work on. And I think Muhammad can speak a lot more on the other end. So Muhammad, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. To answer Ravneet's question very simply, it's fear. It's fear. One, a lot of these store owners, English is not their first language, right? So they're afraid to step into these forums and try to make a point, and it comes off wrong, or they might say a word wrong, or they might say a word that they don't know is derogatory, but it might be. So the fact that English is not their first language stops a lot of them from wanting to have a real open discussion. Second of all, the fear of anything happening to their business because of things they say. We have to keep in mind that for these store owners, a lot of them, this is their livelihood, literally. They feed their families. Some send money overseas to their mom or dad that's sick, or so on and so forth. So this might feed 2 or 3 families. So to them, should I risk alienating some people that shop with me in order to have what some might deem as a meaningless conversation? I'll pass, Habibi. That's what they always say is I'll pass on that because I don't want to risk going through that. And last, the fear again of the city. These guys are petrified of Chicago. I have, I've reached out some of the bigger stakeholders, as I say, the guys that own the wholesales and, 10, 20 stores. And right away, they shut me down. Mo, don't even mention it to me. And they'll tell you, we don't want any problems. Leave us alone. We're happy. We don't want the aldermen on our back. We don't want the community groups on our back. We'd rather keep it going this way and sustain our businesses than open up a can of worms where we don't know where it's going to head. So almost always the answer comes down to fear from store owners. Again, these are bottom line people. They look at their bottom line. And is this going to help or hurt my bottom line? They're just not going to entertain it. So that's been a little bit of a struggle. Getting the younger ones to come is a little bit easier. They're more comfortable. They've been raised in America. They speak English. But the young ones are not buying these stores. The generations are kind of not really going into retail. So you don't have too many of them. So that's been the major issue that I've had on my end, is just the fear of speaking out and saying the wrong thing or having the city on your back.
I'd also like to add something, if that's okay. I feel like there are stereotypes about both different groups. Each group have their own preconceived idea of what the other group is like. Like for instance, there may be a stereotype that many African American people are violent, or they're going to come into these stores and steal, which is not necessarily true. And there's also a stereotype that these store owners will follow you or call the police for the smallest issue. Both of these preconceived notions about the other groups, in my opinion, is what's holding both groups back from sitting down and having meaningful conversations, because I'm sure that the stereotypes of African Americans have some store owners very concerned, whereas they may be more on guard or more aggressive to protect their store, which is understandable. And many African American people who are going to these stores are more have their own guards as well.
Yeah, and I think I can chime in here too. Is one thing that I think about, and thank you everybody for sharing, is in addition to these preconceived notions, also recognizing at the end of the day, the person who is running the business is in a different position, privilege, and standing in the community. So and we have many conversations about this, Mohammed. You do want to speak to people's self-interest. So for a business owner, that's their profit. But at some point, if we want to see the change that we have, it's going to require some pushing and some sacrifice on those things, because if we're trying to combat the system the way that racism and capitalism is set up against each other, we're going to have to fight against that profit motive a little bit and start building other ways that we're going to support each other. And I'm just naming that as a tension in this, that at some point, what we're doing here isn't going to be completely comfortable. We're going to have to agitate and push people to take some what might seem like losses, but at the end of the day are actually wins for everybody. So just want to name that, and that sometimes isn't always going to be just about sharing stories and conversations. It's going to be about, well, we have to actually push here and try something different here, even if there with a cost associated. And I think part of what the work in terms of organizing is building up enough of a body and a base that will be able to support that transition through. Let me see if there's any other questions.
This is Layla. I'm commenting from California. I work in public health, and just from a public health perspective, we have a lot of approaches for when we want to see behavior change. Sometimes it's some type of economic incentive. Sometimes, there's different incentives, but one thing I'm thinking about is some type of certificate program or something that can bring a sense of pride, that can be published somewhere on the website for IMAN or on the windows of the store that just designate that these stores have gone through this process, that this is a trusted community partner, might be a way to incentivize the store owners to come. And also for Black and other minority people who attend the store, they'll look and they'll say, okay, this is a good place. This is someone who I know has gone through this training. They've thought about these things, they've had these conversations, and hopefully I can trust that I'll be treated, as a full human, not in any derogatory way. Ideally, there would be some type of financial incentive for attending the training. This is just so common in public health. We incentivize financially everything. It plays into capitalism in bad ways, but I think that's another thing to consider.
No, thank you, Layla. And that's something actually that we've done in the past in our campaign. When people host that map that I showed earlier, those who signed on as partner corner stores, part of that was some signage outside the store as well as within the store, because part of that agreement signing on is that they had a dedicated section for fresh produce or nutritious, healthy foods. And that's something that we also, got that advice from other public health. And so to hear that again in terms of, it might be time maybe to do a refresh of that. So I appreciate that. And the other thing I think about is, aside from like just how we incentivize by signing on and having signage or anything at the storefronts, is I've been thinking about how we're also building collective power among the stores. So the idea of what does it look like to create a store owners association as part of this too. And I've had conversations with Mohammed about this. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but just thinking about ways to imagine other ways of doing this work. One inspiration I have is from New York City, where the largely Yemeni merchants there went on strike after the Muslim ban, which is a show of power of these stores. And then I wonder what could happen if we actually had built up the kind of solidarity, had these conversations where the stores would be able to shut down their stores after an event like the non-acquittal of a cop who killed a Black man. So what would that world look like if we actually were able to build up that kind of power, have those kind of conversations, so that the stores were another kind of way to build in that kind of way. Did anybody else have anything else to add in terms of that public health perspective that Layla shared? If not, I wanted to go ahead. Fatima, yes, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. You actually already talked about it. So, assalamu alaikum, guys. My name is Fatima. I am from Detroit, and I work with ABISA, the African Bureau for Immigration and Social Affairs. So this is a really interesting program in the sense that a lot of organizers in Detroit have tried to almost kind of like loosely start this going. So it's really nice to see a more structured approach to it, I think, and to get all of us on the same page. I wanted to bring up an issue that I know we had faced as we started doing this in the various forms that have, kind of come up and then died down again. And it's related to what you said about, a possible, corner store owner association, in the sense that in Detroit, it's kind of split down the middle. It's not like New York where almost all the bodegas are owned by Yemenis and they're all Muslim. In Detroit, you have the gas stations that are owned by Muslim Arabs. You have the liquor stores owned by Chaldeans. And then it's kind of a toss up as it relates to the different, grocery stores that you'll find, because you will find grocery stores in Detroit. It's just terrible produce, oftentimes rotting meat, all of that stuff. And so here, one of the biggest things is, let's say we could maybe get solidarity between the Muslim, shop owners. It's hard to get the solidarity with the Chaldean shop owners, especially with the lack of like younger Chaldean organizers, mostly because of Islamophobia within, and the trauma and the hurt of years of Chaldeans being, persecuted minorities within the Middle East and stuff like that. And so wondering if and hoping that, whatever curriculum does come out will allow for that kind of conversation to be had, because, in cities like Detroit, it's not as clean cut as other cities, right? Where it's like one ethnic group has a monopoly on everything. Here it is a Middle Eastern monopoly, but it's different, ethno groups from the Middle East that have different monopolies on different things. And that was kind of like, I think that was the biggest issue. And even when folks like, me, Leila from actually MuslimARC here, when we were trying to start this stuff on our own, it was the biggest thing that people were telling us, now you can't recreate what Iman did in Chicago here. Like they would straight up say that to us. You can't recreate it because the Chaldeans, And I feel like that's not something that we should be, I mean, it's definitely an obstacle. And I was wondering if that was something that you guys had anticipated, or if that is, exists in some kind of form in Chicago or any other cities where you may have launched. I don't know if Atlanta has it, or if it's just something that you have, anticipated and are maybe including within the curriculum.
So I can, like, just to be kind of really quick, I mean, one, we wanted to like test out these ideas, but we're also talked about like, well, what does this, like not all store owners are Muslim. So how do you reach, like Arab Christians? So we've had that conversation. And then also like in some of the language, you could see like where we talked about immigrant store owners. So like you have like in Los Angeles, like, I mean, they're not like, I mean, you're talking Korean owned stores, like these tensions are across the country, right? So what we want to do is like kind of create this model, really get a good sense of like how we went about this, and then think about how do we replicate this across different lines. But I would say like we're not quite at that area like where we're like where we could take into account the Detroit, the situation in Detroit or what exactly happens in San Bernardino. But I think having those conversations and considerations, right? Like as we're building out curriculum and as we're talking with stakeholders and doing surveys and interviews, that'll help us develop a stronger curriculum. Mind you, I mean, we've only been into this like for a month, I mean, as far as like building out this next level of curriculum. But I mean, and Iman has been working on this like since I started getting into work in food justice in 2006. Like that's when I first learned of Iman. And it has deeply informed like the work that I do, which is why like I was like, yes, like when Rami approached me, like I was like, yeah, I'm in, like he didn't have to like, twist my arm or anything, like I was in. But I do recognize like that there are other complex dynamics across the country, and that we'll have to take that into consideration as we build that out and build out partnerships and thinking about hyper local. That's where, like we don't think we could necessarily have something that could just be true for all over the country. But it's like if there's principles around organizing and building solidarity, that may be helpful. And for dealing with Muslims, it's a lot like for us, like because of Islamophobia, like we have a deeper commitment to each other. So sometimes like that baseline does help. And then sometimes it can make it more challenging because we're so close, like it's like talking to your own family and that kind of resistance. So yeah, I mean, I'll let Ahmed take it over from here, but the more feedback that we can get in specific locations and challenges, that'll help us, really get to some nuance and strengths in the curriculum.
I provide a quick strategy. Was it for Fatima? I think it was. I think you made a great point. I actually went to law school in Michigan, so I'm very familiar with that dynamic. We don't have that as much here, only because the Arabs and Muslims still kind of fall under the Arab banner. So we don't necessarily, we have a lot of Jordanian and Palestinian Christians, but they all fall under the Arab banner. But the dynamics are shifting out here. The Yemeni store owners are slowly becoming the majority. So there is some of that. But the Fatma, the strategy that I use, you need to find the power brokers of each community, right? You need to find a Chaldean. There's always power brokers in business. There's always those 3 or 4 owners that the rest of the owners look at and mimic, emulate, or go to for funding, or so on and so forth. So if you find the power brokers from each community, if you can sell them, the rest will follow them. And then you work on the other community and get their power brokers on board. So I aim for the top. I aim for the guys that I know have the reputation of doing very well and having a lot of businesses. I go after them and I push them because it's kind of a monkey see, monkey do. If one store owner who's very wealthy and owns a lot is doing something, the other store owners are going to look at it. So you have a challenge. Like I said, I've been in Michigan. That's a great point. But go find your power brokers, work them. I think if you could work them, it will be a trickle-down effect.
Thank you, Mohammed. So just to address a couple things that showed up in the chat too, and thank you, Margaret, as well. So yeah, so we'll be sharing some of the 7 witness principles in the survey. I'll share out shortly. I also wanted to shout out Mrs. Stella, if you're still on the line. Thank you for showing up. She's another one of our community leaders who has been involved in this work every, day to day, week to week, shows up without fail to our meetings. So thank you, shout out to her. Thank you everybody for the ways that we're thinking about how does this apply to our own context, to your own context. And again, our work has been very much because believing in that, we can be most effective where we are. So there are things about Detroit that I will not know that you'll be able to address, of course. And what I'm hoping for is that then it can become a reciprocal relationship. So from what you're trying in Detroit, we can also learn here in Chicago so that we are able to kind of crack this together. And going off of what Muhammad was saying about, if you're able to convince, a certain model that can be replicated, that's how a lot of these stores work. And that's how we're in the situation that we're in. They inherited this corner store model from somewhere else in terms of, oh, you just sell cigarettes, junk food, lotto, and this is how you run a business and this is how you succeed. And you don't want to mess with that model because you're afraid of your profit motive. So if we're able to create another kind of model that can be replicated and proven to be successful, that's what we're trying to do here, and that's one of the things we're doing at IMAN on 63rd and Racine. And I'll share that link quickly, if I can find it. Is a project that we're working with several partners. I just put the link in the chat, and it's different kinds of development we're trying at that intersection in Chicago, 63rd and Racine. One of them being a fresh marketplace or a model corner store. If you see on the website, there's a tab at the top about membership. Yes, so if you live in Inglewood, you have priority to become a member of this co-op. There's also opportunities if you're not a member or a resident in Inglewood or surrounding areas, you can still become a supporter. So if this is a model that you're interested in supporting, it's something that you can support. The other thing that another way that you can immediately get involved is sign up for the training. So many of you maybe have heard about this event because you signed up in our first event that you're interested in the trainings. And this is a continuing conversation that we'll have. So I've already connected with some people who have been able to attend meetings or been able to give feedback as we're developing this together and starting some preliminary conversations. Although first wanting to try it out in Chicago in terms of how, in this moment, how we can really start pushing for another change. The last thing also, so we did say we're going to share a survey. I think Sara, if you're there, so we have a survey ready to go. Sara just put it in the chat, and shout out to Sara for all the work she's been doing behind the scenes to make this happen, and also all the work she's been putting into this campaign historically. So we do have that survey there. You can check out the principles there. Thank you, Muhammad. So the Shalaki, the principles are there in that survey. You can check them out. And we would like to hear your honest feedback about the principles. So with that, Sara, I don't know if you had anything else you'd like to add. I know you've been in the background, but I wanted to give you a chance if you had anything that you wanted to say or add.
Yeah, I mean, thank you everybody for, Marguerite, Muhammad, Patrice, Ahmed for leading the conversation, but also just everybody for, for being here tonight, and also just for for all of your engagement. And I think, just sort of your challenges, your questions, your agitation. I think that is all, inshallah, what's going to help us to build the type of curriculum that we really need in this moment, and that is not like tone deaf in any way. And so, but that it can also be kind of like shaped and replicated in your city based off of the context that makes sense. And so, and this is also an ongoing conversation. I know Ravneet, you were asking in the chat, I wish, you were saying you wish that your own father, who's a store owner, in Indiana, that he was, part of the conversation too. I think that we also have to be thinking about how do we have, more spaces like this too, that do include, include store owners in the conversation. So this is just, again, the second of a series of conversations that we all hope to be having with everybody, across the country, as we're developing the curriculum and even after that. So thank you again, everybody, for being here tonight and just bringing your full selves.
Thank you, Sara. want to give opportunity, Marguerite or Patricia, did you have any last words that you wanted to share, some parting words to the audience?
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, I'm really, this is such a thoughtful, honest conversation and really highlights the importance of systems change work. And I'm really excited to be partners in developing curriculum. So on the MuslimARC end, you know, for those who want to get involved in curriculum building, if you're an educator, even if you're like a lay person, there's ways you can get involved. So there's muslimarc.org, so you can join. You can support. So we always have like volunteer positions open, and just, you know, stay engaged and in touch, and follow us at MuslimARC. And that's all across social media channels. And yeah, we're taking feedback and information. So thank you so much for everything. This is really, really helpful and inspiring.
Thank you, Marguerite. And yes, so this is a continuing conversation. And thank you, everybody. Also, I think it went out on Facebook. I'm not sure where this reached, but this has been recorded. So please do share if people weren't able to see it. We'll keep you abreast of ways that we're planning to have these conversations and bring in all the necessary voices that we can to keep this work moving. So with that, thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for your input. I hope that we're still able to continue to build together. And just to end with a short prayer, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. By the passage of time, verily humankind is in loss, except for those who come together in steadfastness and come together in patience and good works. So thank you, everybody. Have a blessed night. Be safe, and we'll be in touch. You've seen the link to the survey again. Please do fill that out. Whatever feedback you have will be valuable. And when you fill out the survey, we will add you to the list to keep you updated on further conversations. Have a good night, everybody.